All right, it is that time of year again where people are putting out their top 10 lists of the year. I never really like doing those top 10 worst album reviews. I don't know, I'm not a big fan of talking about albums that I don't like. So what I like to do instead is just kind of do a disappointments and surprises, and this allows me to kind of balance off the spectrum there. I'm going to talk about those albums that I did not like, but I'm also going to talk about those albums that really surprised me. Now, these albums didn't make my top 10, which gives me an excuse to talk about them because I still feel like they need to be talked about in a year-end review. And I've actually split this into a middle category as well, which were meh albums. And these are albums from bands that I love or that have some really good reputation behind them. They were fine, but I mean, at the end of the day, I really didn't think too much about them. So I'm going to start off with my disappointments. I'm going to go to my meh category, and then I'm going to go into my surprises. And luckily, my surprise outlook it's much bigger than the disappointments or the meh. So yeah, let's talk about some of these disappointments. And there were still some few disappointments. Some of these were from bands that, well, actually, most of these were from bands that I was really looking forward to their output, and that's part of the reason why they're disappointments. I was really looking forward to these guys coming into 2019 and throughout the year, and they just didn't deliver. They just didn't really give me what I was hoping for, or they didn't surprise me in a good way. And the first one is the Flower Kings with Waiting for Miracles. Even though this album isn't a bad album, like some of these albums I'm going to be talking about, it's less than a meh. It still didn't really give me enough new material. It just kind of felt very safe, and for Flower King, safe isn't a word that I really want to use. The next one comes from Jeff Lynne's ELO, Out of Nowhere. This one was another kind of the same, and all the things that I had mentioned about the Flower Kings album can pretty much be said about this album as well. I just felt like, I don't know, I felt like this was maybe like a little bit of a cash grab. I felt like there wasn't anything too new to bring about it. Now, I really liked Alone in the Universe, his past work. I thought it did some really good work of capturing themes and capturing motifs, summarizing kind of his discography up to this point, his career. And this just kind of felt like an afterthought, and I wasn't a big fan of that at all. Now, the next one actually comes from Neil Morse, and that is The Great Adventure. Now, The Great Adventure had some really big shoes to fill with Similitude of a Dream, which I loved. That was one of my favorite albums from last year, and the fact that he was so quick of turning out this new album, and I mean, Neil Morse is a powerhouse when it comes to producing and recording music, so I'm not that surprised that the follow-up was so quick after the fact, but I just felt like there wasn't too much new ground to be covered on this. I felt like this was much more of a generic Neil Morse project than the original of the Similitude. I don't know, it didn't land very well. Like, I kept coming back to Similitude throughout the year last year, and I just fell in love deeper and deeper into it. Whereas The Great Adventure, I just didn't feel the point. Like, I didn't really get into it as much as I was really hoping to. Like, there were still some really nice moments on it, but because it is a double discer, it just doesn't, I don't know, resonate. It doesn't really fulfill me as much. And that can also be said about the new Baroness album, Gold and Grey. Now, this one has grown on me a little bit more throughout the year, but it was still a disappointment, especially coming out of 4 just stellar works. Like, up until this point, Baroness had never disappointed me. Each album of theirs surprised me even more and pushed their music even further. I love Purple. It was one of my favorite albums of that year that it came out. And I love Yellow and Green. Yellow and Green is probably my favorite work from them. And so I was really excited for another big movement from them, because Yellow and Green was that kind of double disc album, like one album per color. And Purple was just a Goliath. Like, it was a shorter album, much more contained album. So I was really excited to see how Baroness were going to stretch their legs. And when I heard that this album was a little bit more on the mellow side, they had a new lead guitarist, I was really excited to see where this album was going to go. And it just turned out to be a lot of wandering around. It was very disjointed. It didn't have a real solid identity. They combined Gold and Grey into like a single color, and when you mix Gold and Grey into one color, it just kind of comes out into like a sludge color. And I felt like this was kind of the identity of the album overall. I did love the new lead guitarist. I thought she did an amazing job of bringing a new personality to the band. but it does also feel like a growing album. And not all the experiments that they tried on this album worked. I do appreciate the fact that they experimented quite a bit, but yeah, it didn't fulfill me as much as I was really hoping for. So that's why it was a big disappointment. And another album that does this was Leprous. Their album of Pitfalls just didn't, I don't know, it took what Melina was doing and furthered it. Like, it was much more of a softer approach, much more of an intimate approach, much more of a mellow, atmospheric approach, where Melina had more of a unified personality about it. Like, it had this back to front cohesive listen. I feel like Pitfalls is a lot more disjointed. Like, the first half of the album is really kind of all over the place. It's much more radio friendly, a lot more poppy in approach, even though the songs are a lot more somber and a lot more accessible in that sense. And the second half, there are some really tasty tracks off of this. Like, I love At the Bottom off of this album. I think that was one of my favorite songs off of this track, and one of my favorite songs of theirs since The Flood and The Congregation, as well as The Sky is Red, the bigger track off of this album. And I mean, it's not the best of their longer tracks, because they've had a couple of these longer tracks, but it's still a very tasty track and one that I still really enjoy. But two songs do not make a good album. Yeah, and this brings me to probably my biggest disappointment, and I've already mentioned this before, and I'm going to clear the air a little bit here as well, because I've tweeted about this, but that is Jolly. Jolly put out their album Family, and I mean, they crowdsourced this one. In my review, I said that it was more of a cash grab than anything else. Like, they had financed the album, almost producer style, and then just kind of very minimal effort put out this. And that might have been a misspoke of mine. That might have been a mistake of mine to say that this was just a cash grab, because I do see now, you know, the effort that was put into this. But I mean, at the end of the day, I just don't like the music, and maybe that's just my take off of Jolly. You know, I do enjoy some of their movements from the Audio Guide to Happiness. Some of those movements are really interesting and really dynamic, creating this heavy, happy metal. It's just not for me. I don't like this type of raw metal, and that's part of the reason why I don't like a lot of those bands that also flirt with this type of music. I don't know, I just felt like Family was a big disappointment for me, especially after so long of a wait. I was waiting for something big to happen, and it just never did. So those are my disappointments of the year. Now I'm going to get into the meh, and the meh are albums that I still came back to and I still enjoyed, but they didn't have enough to really satisfy me to the point where I was hoping to. So I'm going to get into some of these, and I think I only have about 5 albums on this list. So the first one was one of the first albums that dropped this year, and that was Steve Hackett's At the Edge of Light. I just felt like Steve Hackett in his later part of his career is still putting out some fantastic music. And if you were to listen to this album in isolation, it's a fantastic listen to. I don't know, it just feels like it's a retread of all the albums within this later part of his career. Everything from pretty much Beyond the Shrouded Horizon. Like, I loved Wolflight. And The Night Siren, like, this is where it kind of follows suit, right? Like, The Night Siren was a little bit of a disappointment for me, just because of how closely it represented and emulated Wolflight. And I just feel like At the Edge of Light does the same thing. It does move the music a little bit forward, but not further enough to really warrant a whole new album. Like, I don't know. It was still like a good time, but as I said, in isolation, good time. In context with the rest of his discography, a little bit of a retread of what we've already heard. The next one is actually Coldplay. Coldplay's Everyday Life. Now, in my review, I did kind of tear it apart, and there was a lot of kind of outsider influences on that album that I didn't appreciate at all. The whole, like, political messaging of it, I thought was a little bit misguided. Good message, just very ill-placed. Like, the music itself is good, and it's also very disappointing. Like, the first half of the album I really enjoyed. I love Aberesque. I love Trouble in Town. I love how they build. I love how they're trying different styles. But, I mean, at the same time, it does make a very odd and disjointed listen from start to finish. And the second half has, you know, some of the worst tracks off of that. I still don't really like Champion of the World, even though I know a lot of people really like that track. And I just don't like Orphans. I feel like these two tracks take what I didn't like from A Head Full of Dreams and moved it forward in not necessarily the greatest light. And yeah, but it still has some really nice tracks. So that's why it wasn't a complete disappointment. it was just kind of a meh when I took a look at the whole album as a whole. Next up is from Flying Colors, their Third Degree album. And again, it was a good album. It just wasn't quite as good as I was hoping. It was much better than Second Nature, for sure, but still not quite as good as that first album that they put out. It didn't have quite the same re-listenable aspects. I didn't keep returning to it quite as much. I like how all the boys on this album feel like they're having a really good time, and that definitely helped me enjoy this album a lot more. But at the same time, I didn't come back to this quite as much. There wasn't quite as much like stellar singles. Like, I still love that second last track, the like almost ELO track, and More was a little bit of a cringe track for me, I'm not gonna lie. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it was still a fine album, and who knows, I might actually return to it a little bit more. Next we come to Lonely Robots Under the Stars, or Under Stars, or whatever it was called. Now, I've loved Lonely Robot, and I really love John Mitchell's work. I love his guitar work. I love all of his work with Arena, It Bites, Kino. My favorite work from him is definitely Frost. That's how I was introduced to this guy, even though Arena's been out for pretty much ever. But I love his presentation, I love his atmosphere building, I love his playing styles, and I really liked his last album of The Lonely Robot, The Big Sleep, or maybe it's The Big Dream. It's one of the two. Really like that album. And it was just leagues ahead of the debut self-titled work. It didn't really hit me. Like, I can't name a single track off of this album, so that's not necessarily a great thing. And speaking about albums that I can't name a single track off of, Dream Theater's Distance Over Time. And now it's no surprise that I'm a huge Dream Theater fan. I love their work, but Distance Over Time just didn't really do anything for me. I feel like they've stopped growing. I feel like they've stopped experimenting. It's one of the two things. They either experiment beyond their capability, which is what we saw with The Astonishing, and I mean, that album still has some really nice moments on it. It's just you have to shift through so much to get to those gold pieces. And the album that came before that of the self-titled work was just generic Dream Theater cut and paste, paint by numbers. And I feel like they went back to that. They still, like, this is leagues ahead of their self-titled work. I feel like that spark of creativity is kind of gone. And like, this album's still good. I'm not discrediting it. This album is still good. It's just meh. Like, outside of maybe Pale Blue Dot and Barstool Warrior, I can't name another song off of this album. Yeah, it's fine. But the most I can say is that it was underwhelming. Which kind of leads me to my last meh album, and one that I wanted to talk about for the year-end review, which is IQ's Resistance. And again, this album's fine. I like it a lot more than Road of Bones. I did not like Road of Bones. Whereas Resistance, double album, I did enjoy this one. Out of all these albums, this one's the closest one to being a surprise album. But at the end of the day, I didn't come back to this as much as I was hoping I would. The structure of this album I actually really like. I like how the first album's much more of like a traditional album construction, a lot of smaller tracks that kind of bleed into one another. That one track, though, I cannot stand. That's that second last track off this album before it gets into that 15-minute really amazing song. I cannot get into it. And the other problem is those first couple of tracks off of the first album, I can't really remember anything from them. And this is after repeated listens. The second album only having 4 tracks, the 2 big bookend tracks, and then the 2 middle smaller tracks. They're enjoyable, and at no point do I really feel like I want to turn it off or stop it or anything like that. I still enjoy it, and I still have a good time with it. All right, let's get into some surprises. I know this review is going to be a longer one. I'm going to refill with some coffee, but let's talk about some surprises. And this, out of all the list, has the most amount of albums on it, which I am very excited to talk about. So let's talk about some surprises. First off, Richard Hensel's Cocoon. Richard Hensel being the lead guitarist from Hackett. Love this album. I know that Hackett had become more of a collaborative effort within the past couple of albums, and it's created some really fun new music, but it's also come up with some duds. Like, I feel like the albums aren't as strong from start to finish as they once were. This one is definitely strong from start to finish. I really was surprised about this album. The only thing that kept it off of the top 10 is that there were so many amazing albums on my top 10, and that's kind of the same for all of these albums. And a lot of these I was going to mention as honorable mentions, but it was just getting too big, and I'm like, you know what, I'm just going to put them on my surprises instead. The next one is Fragments of the Fifth Element from Magic Pie. I really like this album. I kept coming back to it. I love that big song at the end. I like this a lot more than King for a Day. And I really love Magic Pie, and this one I felt like was a fantastic start to finish listen. I could just sit down, listen to it, and really get over it. I love this album. Yeah, as I mentioned, there were a lot of other great albums out this year. Another one that I really liked was Jordan Rudess's Wired for Madness. That first, half of this album, the Wired for Madness suites, part 1 and 2, was brilliant. I think, again, much like Richard Hensel, I love this so much more than I love the Dream Theater album, where Jordan Rudess came from. I love some of the guest stars that he has on this album. I love a lot of the experimentation that he does on this album. This one actually feels the most Emerson, Lake and Palmer in that the first half of this album is brilliant. Second half of this album, I'm like, what are we doing here, bud? There's a lot more experimentation and not everything works. And that's very much like, say, Tarkus. So really like this. This was one that I did come back to quite a bit. But mainly just for that title suite. Next one I found was a really big surprise was Swans Leaving Meaning. This one was less of a, oh my gosh, where did this come from? And more of, all right, I'm digging this. I'm really liking this. And I like some of the things that Swans was doing in their moving forward. I like some of the more experimentational sides of this. Overall, I thought this was a really great treat. I didn't expect me to like this album as much as I did. The next album is the Black Mountains The Destroyer. This was a fantastic album from start to finish. I love the opening and closing track off of this album. It was that heavy album motif that I was really excited for. Canadian band. If you haven't already checked it out, I highly recommend it. And I wanted to talk about this album. Even though it didn't make it onto my top 10 list, I still really wanted to talk about this album. It was one of my favorite albums of the year. Yeah, this was a fantastic treat. Really liked it. Love how dark and menacing this album was and how big the sound was. I think that this is Black Mountain's strongest work to date. And it's one that I'm still planning on picking up in physical format. I really want it in my collection. The next one is Periphery, Hail Stan. And the reason why this is on this album, or on this big surprises list, is the first track of Reptile. I love Reptile. I love Reptile. The rest of the songs are alright. They're kind of touch and go, but Reptile just blew me away. And that was enough to have that album on the surprises list. I kept coming back to this song time and time again. And the rest of the album is just fine. And that's why it didn't make it onto my top 10, because, again, one brilliant, beautiful song does not make for an entire great listen, right? That's the whole point. The final one that I want to talk about, and one that I painfully had to leave off my top 10, was Big Train's The Grand Tour. This album was fantastic. This is probably their best work since Folklore. Their albums that they put out a couple years ago, what was it? Grimm's Pound and Second Star to the Right. Or no, The Second Brightest Star. Second Star to the Right's Peter Pan. Those two albums just didn't do anything for me. I felt like it was kind of a retread of ground that we've already been on. The Grand Tour has some really tasty tracks off of it. Ones that I really dug. But I found the biggest problem is that there were too many stop and go moments. There was too many moments where I felt like the track had stopped because they had introduced silence, and then they kept it going for another 3 or 4, sometimes 5 minutes. And I felt like once or twice on an album is fine, but they did it 3 or 4 times, and I'm like, that's a little too much. That's a little too much. But I still love the tracks off this album. There were a lot of moments that I'm like, they're creating such a grand sound. And I always love the Big Train motif of being more of a folky, very UK centric. It was retro prog without being a complete retread. Rickard Solblum on this album, the guy from Beardfish, he still shines very bright on this album, and that's enough for me to just give it all the praise. So I had to end off with Big Train's the Grand Tour as one of the surprises of this year, because I wasn't honestly looking forward to this album. I felt like Big Train had just kind of found themselves into a comfortable area, and they didn't really want to move too far out of it. And this album still kind of does that. Like, it is definitely in their comfort zone, but at least I found like they were doing some new things enough to get me excited and interested. So those are my kind of recap of this year in terms of my disappointments, those albums that meh, and then my surprises. Later on this week, I'm going to be dropping my top 10, those top 10 albums that I loved, that I didn't get to talk about in this review, this big thing. And I'm really excited to talk about those. So look for that later on this week. It'll either drop on Wednesday, being Christmas, or it's going to drop on Friday, whichever one I can get that out to in time. So look forward to that later on this week. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.